James was always the ideal man. At least, that's how he appeared to the world. He had the looks, the charm, and the perfect family. A beautiful wife, Sophia, who adored him, and a house in the suburbs that screamed success. But no one saw the truth behind the closed doors of their home. Sophia had been sick for months, her energy draining day by day, but James kept it hidden from her, from everyone. When the doctors finally gave her the diagnosis, the truth hit like a sledgehammer. Terminal cancer. There was no cure. She had mere months, maybe weeks, to live. Sophia was crushed. She had already lost both of her parents in a car accident just a few months ago. The grief had been unbearable, and now this new horror, the discovery of her illness, seemed too much for her to bear. She felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, trapped in an endless nightmare. She had no family left to turn to, no friends close enough to offer comfort. James was supposed to be her rock, her protector in this battle, but he wasn't there for her. James, instead of stepping up as the husband he promised to be, began pulling away. At first, it was subtle, longer hours at work, sudden meetings he never discussed. Then came the lies. He told Sophia he was too busy to help her with her treatments, that there was no one available to accompany her to the doctor's appointments. But the truth was darker. James had found someone else, a younger woman, a woman who made him feel alive again, someone who saw him as the hero, someone who didn't remind him of the pain and suffering that had overtaken his life with Sophia's illness. He was sneaking around, visiting his mistress, while his wife lay in bed, deteriorating. The woman, Karen, was everything that Sophia was no longer. She was vibrant, full of energy, and independent. Nothing like the fragile, pale version of his wife he was now trying to avoid. He had convinced himself that Sophia's death was inevitable and, in his mind, it was just a matter of time before she was gone. That meant his inheritance would come, and he could finally start over with Karen, without the burden of a sick wife and the constant reminders of his failures. When Sophia's condition worsened, James decided he could no longer pretend. He couldn't bear the guilt of looking at her, watching her slowly fade away, knowing that he had no intention of being there for her in the end. He made his decision in the dead of night, without a shred of compassion for the woman who had given him everything. He told her he was leaving. "James, what are you saying? Please don't leave me." Sophia's voice trembled, her eyes filled with confusion and pain as she looked at him. The woman who had once been his partner, the one who had shared his dreams, now lay fragile and frail before him, begging for him not to abandon her. But he didn't care. He had made his choice. "I'm sorry, Sophia. I have to go," he said coldly, turning his back on her. The door slammed shut behind him, and in that moment, Sophia's heart shattered. The world as she knew it had crumbled. She was alone. Days turned into weeks, and Sophia's health continued to deteriorate. She couldn't understand how the man she loved, the man she had married, could leave her in her most vulnerable state. She had nothing left. Her parents were gone, and now her husband was abandoning her. The pain was too much to bear. But as she lay in that hospital bed, she made a decision that would change everything. She would not let him win. She would not let him destroy her, no matter how much it hurt. Sophia had always been strong, but now she had to dig deeper than she ever had before. She had to find the strength to live for herself, to not let this betrayal define her. In the silence of her hospital room, she began to write letters. Letters to James, to Karen, to herself. In those letters, she poured out her pain, her betrayal, her loss. But she also found clarity. She wrote of forgiveness, not for James or Karen, but for herself. She could no longer let their actions poison her heart. Sophia's body was failing her, but her spirit began to rise from the ashes of her suffering. She didn't know how long she had left, but she would not let James or anyone else decide how her story would end. In the darkest of times, she found a flicker of light. It wasn't from him, but from her own resilience. And with that strength, she began to plan. She would leave her mark on the world, even if it was just through the love she had for herself and the people who had truly cared for her. Her heart ached with every breath, but she was determined. This was not the end of her story. It was just the beginning. Sophia's nights were the loneliest. The hospital room, illuminated by the faint, sterile glow of a bedside monitor, felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. The hum of machines and the occasional footsteps of passing nurses were her only companions. She lay on her side, her body frail, her once vibrant skin now pale and drawn. Her hand instinctively rested on the letters she had been writing, the ink smudged in places from tears that had fallen as she poured out her soul. Each night, Sophia relived the betrayal. She could still hear the cold finality in James's voice when he told her he was leaving. His words replayed in her mind like a cruel symphony, each note sharper than the last. "I have to go," he had said, as if abandoning her was a chore, something to be done quickly and without fuss. And he had gone, leaving her to face her illness, her grief, and her shattered world alone. At first, Sophia had succumbed to despair. She cried until she had no more tears left to shed, her body trembling under the weight of her sadness. But as the weeks passed, she began to feel a spark deep within her. It wasn't a loud, triumphant thing. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, like the first glow of dawn after a long, dark night. One afternoon, as Sophia stared blankly out of the hospital window, a nurse entered her room carrying a tray. It was Grace, a woman with a warmth that seemed to radiate from her very presence. Grace was in her 40s, with kind brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled, and a voice that was both firm and soothing. "You've barely touched your lunch, Sophia," Grace said, placing the tray on the table beside her. Sophia turned her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not hungry." Grace pulled up a chair and sat down, her gaze steady and compassionate. "You're not just feeding your body, you're feeding your spirit. And trust me, Sophia, your spirit needs all the strength it can get." Sophia let out a weak laugh, the sound foreign to her after so many weeks of silence. "I don't even know what strength feels like anymore." Grace leaned forward, her hand gently resting on Sophia's. "You're stronger than you think. You're here, aren't you? You're fighting every day, even when it feels impossible. That's strength." It was the first time in weeks that someone had spoken to her as if she were more than her illness, more than her pain. Grace's words stayed with Sophia long after the nurse had left the room. That night, she picked up her pen and began to write again. Not letters filled with bitterness or sadness, but letters filled with resolve. To herself, she wrote, "I have been abandoned, but I will not abandon myself. I have been broken, but I will rebuild. I will not let James define my worth. I will not let this disease steal my spirit. I will rise from this." The words came slowly at first, then faster, flowing onto the page like a river breaking free of a dam. For the first time, Sophia felt a glimmer of hope. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She would not let James's betrayal be the final chapter of her story. The next morning, Grace returned to find Sophia sitting upright, her letters neatly stacked on the bedside table. "Good morning, Grace," Sophia said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Well, look at you," Grace replied with a smile. "There's a light in your eyes I haven't seen before." Sophia nodded, her hand resting over her heart. "I'm not done fighting." From that day forward, Sophia leaned on that spark of hope, nurturing it as if it were the only thing keeping her alive. And maybe it was. In the darkest hours of her life, she had found a flicker of light, a light that, unbeknownst to her, would eventually grow into a beacon of strength, guiding her toward a destiny she never imagined possible. Sophia's days began to shift after that first conversation with Grace. The nurse didn't just provide care, she provided presence, something Sophia hadn't felt in so long. Grace's visits became the highlight of Sophia's otherwise monotonous days. Each time Grace entered the room, her vibrant energy seemed to sweep away the cold sterility of the hospital. One afternoon, Grace walked in with a thermos and 2 cups. She set them down on Sophia's bedside table with a playful grin. "Hospital coffee is terrible," Let's pretend we're at a cafe, shall we? Sophia tilted her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. A cafe in Paris, maybe? Grace laughed, pouring steaming tea into the cups. Paris it is. But you'll have to forgive the lack of croissants. As they sipped their tea, Sophia found herself sharing more than she had intended. The story of James, his betrayal, and the loneliness that had consumed her spilled out like water from a broken dam. She told Grace about the letters, about how she wrote to heal the wounds James had left behind. Grace listened intently, her hands wrapped around her cup. When Sophia finished, Grace's eyes were filled with something unexpected, not pity, but admiration. "You've been through hell," she said softly, "but here you are, writing your way out of it. Do you realize how powerful that is?" Sophia looked away, her cheeks flushing. "It doesn't feel powerful. It feels desperate." "Desperation can be a spark," Grace replied. "It's what you do with that spark that matters. And you're turning it into a fire." Grace's words lingered with Sophia long after the tea had gone cold. That night, as the hospital quieted, she picked up her pen again. This time, her writing wasn't just for herself. It was for others, others like her, who had been abandoned, betrayed, or left to face life's greatest challenges alone. The words came more easily now, as if the act of sharing her pain with Grace had unlocked something within her. She began drafting letters not just to James or Karen, but to strangers. Letters of encouragement, letters that said, "You are not alone. You are stronger than you know." By morning, Sophia had a stack of papers on her bedside table. When Grace walked in, she raised an eyebrow at the pile. "What's this?" "Planning to start a revolution." Sophia laughed, a sound that was becoming more familiar in her room. "Maybe. Or at least, a rebellion against despair." Grace picked up one of the letters and read it silently. When she finished, she looked at Sophia with tears in her eyes. This is more than writing, Sophia. This is hope. You're giving people hope." As the days turned into weeks, Grace became more than a caregiver. She became an ally, a friend, and a co-conspirator in Sophia's quiet revolution. Grace began smuggling books into the hospital, memoirs of survival, poetry, and stories of triumph against all odds. Each book seemed to ignite a new spark in Sophia, reminding her that her pain didn't have to define her. One afternoon, Grace wheeled a small typewriter into Sophia's room. "You said you wanted to write," she said with a wink. "Well, now you can do it properly." Sophia's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth in surprise. "Grace, I can't accept this." "Sure you can," Grace replied, setting it on the table. "Consider it an investment. The world needs your words, Sophia. Start writing." Sophia ran her fingers over the keys, the cool metal grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in months. She looked up at Grace, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Grace smiled, leaning against the wall. "Don't thank me yet. I expected dedication in your first book." The more Sophia wrote, the more her spirit seemed to grow. Her letters turned into essays, and her essays began to feel like chapters in a story she was determined to tell. She didn't know if she would ever publish them, but for the first time, she felt like her life had meaning beyond the pain. One evening, as Grace helped her organize her pages, Sophia hesitated. "Do you think it's foolish?" she asked. "To believe my words could make a difference?" Grace paused, placing the pages neatly on the table. "Sophia, words have the power to change lives. They've already changed yours, haven't they?" Sophia nodded slowly, her hand resting over her heart. Maybe they can change someone else's too." "They will," Grace said firmly. "You're not just surviving, Sophia. You're thriving. And that's the kind of story people need to hear." By the time Sophia left the hospital, she was no longer the broken woman James had left behind. She was a woman with purpose, a woman who had turned her suffering into strength. Grace hugged her tightly on her last day, whispering, "Don't let anyone dim your light, Sophia. You've come too far." Sophia walked out of the hospital with a folder full of letters and essays, a typewriter waiting for her at home, and a spark in her heart that burned brighter than ever. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to face it. Little did she know, her words would soon echo far beyond her own life, touching hearts she had never met and shaking the very foundation of the man who had betrayed her. James had always been a man of appearances. To the outside world, he seemed to have moved on seamlessly. He strolled through high-end restaurants, his arm wrapped around Karen, who wore her confidence as boldly as her designer dresses. Together, they made the perfect picture, polished, enviable, untouchable. But behind closed doors, cracks in their facade were beginning to show. Karen's charm had been intoxicating at first, her laughter infectious, her energy irresistible. But as the weeks turned into months, her demands grew louder. She had expected a life of luxury, of effortless indulgence, and James had promised her just that. However, his promises were built on a foundation of assumptions that relied on Sophia's absence. James, Karen snapped one evening as she examined herself in a gilded mirror, her tone laced with irritation. You told me this was temporary. When are we moving into something grander? This apartment is hardly what I imagined. James glanced up from his glass of whiskey, his jaw tightening. It's coming, he said, his voice clipped. You just need to be patient. Patient? Karen spun around, her hands on her hips. I didn't leave everything behind to live like this. You said we'd have it all. Where is it? James felt the familiar surge of irritation rise within him. Karen's vibrancy, which had once been so alluring, now grated against his nerves. You think I'm not working on it? Do you have any idea what I'm dealing with? Karen rolled her eyes, flopping onto the couch. All I know is, you're not delivering. Maybe you're not as capable as you made yourself out to be. Her words hit harder than James cared to admit. The truth was, he was starting to feel the weight of his decisions. He had walked away from Sophia, convinced that her illness and impending death would be his ticket to freedom, but her resilience was something he hadn't anticipated. She wasn't fading quietly into the background as he had hoped. She was fighting, and in doing so, she was forcing him to face his own failures. James couldn't shake the unease that crept over him at night. He would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, Karen's shallow breathing beside him, and wonder if he had made a mistake. But his pride wouldn't let him admit it. He had chosen this path, and now he had to see it through. One evening, as James sat in his office poring over financial statements, his phone buzzed. It was a message from one of his old acquaintances, someone who still followed Sophia's updates online. James hesitated, his thumb hovering over the notification. Finally, curiosity got the better of him, and he opened it. The message was brief, but the attachment said it all, a photo of Sophia leaving the hospital. She was thinner than he remembered, her frame fragile, but there was a light in her eyes he hadn't seen in years. She was smiling in a way that made his chest tighten. For the first time, James felt something he couldn't identify. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It wasn't regret. It was a strange, gnawing sense of loss. Karen walked in at that moment, her heels clicking against the floor. What's got you so serious? She asked, peering over his shoulder. When she saw the photo, her lip curled. Is that her? Why are you even looking at that? James quickly locked his phone, setting it face down on the desk. It's nothing, he muttered. But the image stayed with him, haunting him in the quiet moments when his bravado slipped away. Karen noticed the shift in him, and it only deepened the growing chasm between them. She began to question whether James was the golden ticket she had imagined, or just another man who overpromised and underdelivered. Their arguments became more frequent, more volatile. Karen's once flattering admiration turned to sharp criticism, her words cutting deeper than James would admit. You're a disappointment, she spat one evening after yet another heated exchange. Maybe you should have stayed with her. At least then, you'd still have your dignity. James didn't respond. He couldn't, because for the first time he wondered if she was right. Sophia sat at her modest kitchen table, the morning sunlight streaming through the window and highlighting the small folder before her. Inside were the documents that would rewrite the future James had so carelessly assumed was his. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the folder and reviewed the details with a calm determination that had grown stronger each day. The lawyer, a kind and methodical man named Michael, had listened intently as Sophia explained her wishes during their meeting the previous week. She had spoken softly but firmly, her voice no longer betraying the fragility of her body. "I want to ensure that everything I have goes towards something meaningful. Not a penny is to be wasted, especially not on him." Michael had nodded, impressed by her clarity and purpose. "We'll make sure it's all taken care of. No loopholes, no mistakes. It'll be ironclad." Now, as Sophia looked over the finalized documents, she felt a sense of control she hadn't felt in years. The money her parents had left her, the investments she had carefully managed, the home she had shared with James, all of it was being redirected to causes she truly cared about. Cancer research, shelters for women who had been abandoned, education programs for underprivileged children. Every dollar was a deliberate choice, a symbol of her strength and the life she was reclaiming. In the stillness of the room, she smiled faintly. James had always believed he was the one in control, the master of their shared future. He had taken her loyalty and kindness for granted, assuming they made her weak. But he had underestimated her. He had no idea that while he schemed and plotted, she had been quietly building a legacy far greater than he could ever comprehend. The sound of the doorbell jolted Sophia from her thoughts. She rose slowly, her body still adjusting to its limitations, and made her way to the door. Grace stood on the other side, holding a bouquet of sunflowers. "These are for you," Grace said with a warm smile, handing over the vibrant arrangement. "A little reminder of the light you bring into this world." Sophia accepted them with gratitude, placing the flowers in a glass vase on the kitchen table. "Thank you, Grace. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Grace sat down across from her, glancing at the folder. "So, it's all set." Sophia nodded, her smile growing. "Every last detail. He won't get a single cent, Grace. Everything he abandoned me for, he won't see a penny of it." Grace chuckled, a twinkle of admiration in her eyes. "You're incredible, you know that? To go through everything you've been through and still come out of it stronger. Not many people can say the same." Sophia looked at her friend, her expression softening. "I had to learn the hard way that strength isn't about holding on. It's about knowing when to let go." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sophia sat by the window, gazing out at the golden sky. She thought of James, of the life they had once shared, and of the choices that had led them to this moment. There was no bitterness in her heart, only a quiet resolve. She had built something new for herself, something that no one could take away. And somewhere in the depths of her mind, she knew that the day of reckoning was drawing closer. The day James would realize just how little he truly had left. Months passed, and James's life began to unravel in ways he hadn't anticipated. Karen, once the fiery and vibrant woman who had made him feel alive, had grown restless. The promises he had made, of wealth, travel, and freedom, remained unfulfilled. The cracks in their relationship widened with every passing day, and Karen's patience wore thinner. One evening, Karen stood by the window of their small apartment, staring out at the city lights with a glass of wine in hand. Her posture was stiff, her frustration evident. "I didn't sign up for this, James," she said, her tone sharp. "We're stuck in the same rut you were trying to escape. What's the point?" James, sitting on the couch with a laptop balanced on his knees, barely looked up. "I told you things take time. The money will come." Karen turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. "Will it? Because all I see is you sitting there, making excuses. Maybe it's time I stop waiting around for something that's never going to happen." Her words cut deeper than James wanted to admit. He set the laptop aside, running a hand through his hair. "You think this is easy for me? Do you think I don't know what's at stake?" Karen scoffed, placing her glass on the table with a clink. "What's at stake is my time, James. And I'm not going to waste any more of it." Without another word, she grabbed her purse and left, the door slamming shut behind her. James stared at the door for a long moment, the silence of the apartment pressing down on him. For the first time, he felt the weight of the choices he had made. He had abandoned a woman who had loved him unconditionally, only to chase a dream that was slipping through his fingers. The following morning, James woke to a buzzing phone. He groaned, reaching for it on the nightstand, his vision blurry from the hangover that had crept up on him during the night. The number was unfamiliar, but something compelled him to answer. "Mr. James," the voice on the other end said, professional and measured. "This is Michael Carter, Sophia's attorney. We need you to come to the office regarding her estate." James's heart skipped a beat. Estate. The word echoed in his mind, bringing with it a flicker of hope. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. He quickly composed himself, clearing his throat. "Of course. What time should I be there?" The meeting was set for the following week, and for the first time in months, James felt a sense of control returning. He dusted off his best suit, rehearsed his demeanor, and envisioned how he would celebrate once the inheritance was officially his. He imagined paying off debts, starting fresh, and finally delivering on the promises he had made to Karen. Maybe, he thought, she would come back once she saw the money. When the day of the meeting arrived, James walked into the lawyer's office with an air of confidence. The waiting room was quiet, the walls lined with bookshelves and certificates. He was greeted by Michael, a man whose calm and steady gaze unnerved him more than he cared to admit. "Thank you for coming, Mr. James," Michael said, extending a hand. "Please have a seat." James sat down across from him, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He watched as Michael opened a folder, his movements deliberate. The anticipation was almost unbearable. "As you know," Michael began, "Sophia made changes to her will before she passed. She was very clear about how she wanted her estate to be handled." James nodded, barely containing his eagerness. "Of course. I'm ready to hear the details." Michael's expression didn't change as he slid a single piece of paper across the desk. Sophia left her estate to several charitable organizations, including cancer research foundations and shelters for women. She was very passionate about ensuring her resources went to those who needed them most. James froze, his breath catching in his throat. "What?" he managed to choke out. That can't be right. She wouldn't." Michael's calm tone didn't waver. "She also left a letter for you. Perhaps it will provide some clarity." The lawyer handed James an envelope. His name was written on the front in Sophia's familiar handwriting. His hands trembled as he opened it, unfolding the letter inside. "James," the letter began, "you always thought you were the one in control, the one who held all the cards. But life has a way of teaching us that what we take for granted can slip through our fingers. I loved you once, but love doesn't survive betrayal. I forgive you, not for your sake, but for mine. And with that forgiveness comes freedom. I hope you find what you're looking for, but it won't be at my expense." The room spun around him. The weight of her words hit him harder than any physical blow ever could. For the first time, James realized the depth of what he had lost, not just the money, but the respect, trust, and love of a woman who had once given him everything. James sat frozen in the lawyer's office, the letter trembling in his hands. Sophia's words echoed in his mind, each one sharper than the last. The weight of her final message was unbearable. For years, he had convinced himself that leaving her had been a necessary choice, a path to a better life. But now, faced with the reality of her strength and her resolve, he realized just how little he had truly understood her. Michael's voice broke through the suffocating silence. "If you have any questions about the allocation of the estate, I can clarify." James looked up, his face pale and his eyes hollow. "No questions," he muttered, his voice barely audible. He rose from his chair, the weight of defeat pressing on his shoulders. "Thank you for your time." The walk out of the office felt like an eternity. Every step echoed in his ears, each one a reminder of his failures. By the time he reached the street, the confidence he had once carried like armor had completely dissolved. He stood on the sidewalk, staring at the bustling world around him, a stark contrast to the emptiness he felt inside. Karen had left him. Sophia had outmaneuvered him. He had gambled everything and lost. For the first time in his life, James felt utterly alone. That evening, he returned to the small apartment he now called home. It was quiet, the air heavy with the smell of stale whiskey and regret. He sank into the worn couch, the letter still in his hand. He read it over and over, hoping to find some loophole, some hint of softness that would give him hope. But Sophia's words were resolute, unyielding, a testament to the strength she had found in his absence. For the first time in years, James allowed himself to feel the full weight of his choices. The guilt, the shame, the overwhelming realization that he had thrown away a woman who had loved him unconditionally. He thought of the nights Sophia must have spent alone, her body weak, but her mind stronger than he had ever given her credit for. He thought of her sitting in that hospital bed, writing letters while he had been dining with Karen, blind to the fact that he was losing the best thing he had ever had. He reached for the bottle of whiskey on the table, pouring himself a glass with a shaky hand. But as he raised it to his lips, he hesitated. The smell, the taste, the entire ritual felt hollow. It wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't bring her back, or undo the damage he had done. With a frustrated growl, he slammed the glass down, the amber liquid spilling onto the table. For hours, he sat in the dark, the letter resting on the table in front of him. The words seemed to glow in the dim light, a haunting reminder of his failures. He thought of calling Karen, of trying to convince her to come back, but even that felt futile. She had made it clear that without money, he was nothing to her. As the nights stretched on, James finally understood the depth of his own emptiness. The life he had built on selfishness and greed had crumbled, leaving him with nothing but the remnants of a man he barely recognized. For the first time, he wasn't angry at Sophia for her choices. He was envious. She had found strength, purpose, and peace, while he was left with the ruins of his own arrogance. The sun rose, casting a faint light into the apartment. James stared at the ceiling, his eyes bloodshot and his mind racing. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he realized that no amount of money or power could ever fill the void he had created. Sophia had been right. Love and loyalty couldn't be bought or faked. And he had lost both forever. Weeks passed, but the ache in James's chest only deepened. The world moved on around him, oblivious to the hollow man he had become. He tried to distract himself, throwing himself into work, but his mind refused to stay focused. Every task, every meeting, every face he encountered seemed to remind him of what he had lost. His once sharp charm and confidence had dulled, replaced by a heaviness that weighed on every interaction. One evening, as James sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, a notification buzzed on his phone. It was an article shared by an old acquaintance. The headline read, "The Sophia Foundation, a legacy of strength and resilience." His breath caught as he clicked the link. The article was accompanied by a photo of Grace cutting the ribbon at the grand opening of a new shelter for women, with a plaque in the background bearing Sophia's name. The words blurred as James stared at the screen. The article spoke of Sophia's courage, her determination to turn her pain into something meaningful. It detailed how she had used her resources to create a foundation that supported cancer patients, provided housing for abandoned women, and funded education for children in need. She had become a symbol of hope and strength, a beacon for those who had been left behind. James's chest tightened as he scrolled through the article. The photo of Grace, smiling warmly as she spoke to a group of women, was followed by a quote from Sophia herself. "No matter what life takes from you, you always have the power to give. That is how we rise." He set the phone down, his hands trembling. Sophia had risen far beyond him, beyond anything he could have imagined. She had taken the pain he had inflicted and turned it into something beautiful, something that would outlast both of them. While he had wallowed in his own selfishness, she had built a legacy of compassion and strength. The realization hit him like a wave, knocking the air from his lungs. He had spent so long blaming others, Sophia, Karen, even fate, for his failures. But now, faced with the undeniable evidence of Sophia's triumph, he could no longer escape the truth. His downfall had been his own doing, and no amount of excuses could change that. That night, James couldn't sleep. He paced the small apartment, his mind racing with memories of Sophia. He thought of her laugh, her kindness, the way she had always believed in him, even when he didn't deserve it. He thought of the nights she must have spent alone, writing letters and building a future without him. And he thought of the person he had become, the man who had thrown it all away. The next morning, James found himself walking aimlessly through the city. He passed the grand opening of the new Sophia Foundation shelter, the sound of laughter and conversation drifting through the air. He stopped at a distance, watching as Grace handed out pamphlets and greeted visitors. The building was bright and welcoming, a stark contrast to the darkness he carried inside. James wanted to approach, to speak to Grace, to say something. But what could he say? What could he possibly offer that would matter? He stood there for a long moment, his hands buried in his pockets, before turning and walking away. The world Sophia had built didn't need him, and he knew he didn't deserve to be a part of it. For the first time, James understood what it meant to truly lose. It wasn't just the money, the status, or even the relationships. It was the chance to be something better, to be the man Sophia had once believed he could be. And that, he realized, was a loss he would carry for the rest of his life. As James walked away from the shelter, the sound of laughter and hope trailing behind him, a deep, unfamiliar ache settled in his chest. It wasn't the sharp sting of regret or the burning shame he had grown accustomed to. It was something heavier, something permanent. He knew, in that moment, that he had crossed a point of no return. Sophia's legacy was untouchable, her strength a towering monument that cast a long shadow over the shallow life he had tried to create. She had risen above everything he had thrown at her, and not just risen, she had soared. Her name was no longer tied to him, no longer weighed down by his betrayal. Instead, it was celebrated, spoken with admiration and love by people whose lives she had touched. James found himself wandering through the city, the bright lights and bustling streets offering no comfort. He passed couples laughing together, families gathered at outdoor cafes, and children running through parks. Each moment of connection he witnessed seemed to magnify the emptiness inside him. He thought of Sophia's words in her letter. "I forgive you, but I will never forget." The forgiveness had felt like a lifeline at first, but now he realized it wasn't a gift for him. It was her freedom, a release from the burden of his actions. By the time James reached his apartment, the weight of his solitude was suffocating. The space, once a haven of his new life with Karen, now felt like a mausoleum, filled with echoes of what could have been. He sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the folded letter on the nightstand. He had read it countless times, hoping to extract something new, something that would ease the crushing reality he now faced. But every word remained the same, unyielding and final. Days turned into weeks, and James fell into a routine of monotony. He went to work, exchanged pleasantries with colleagues, and returned to his empty apartment. The spark that had once driven him, whether for ambition or pleasure, had dimmed to nothing. His world felt colorless, a grayscale existence devoid of meaning. One evening, as James scrolled aimlessly through his phone, he stumbled upon a video. It was a recording of a speech from Grace at a Sophia Foundation event. The room in the video was filled with people, women who had been helped by the foundation, families who had found shelter, and volunteers whose lives had been transformed by Sophia's vision. Grace stood at the podium, her voice steady and filled with warmth. Sophia believed that even in the face of betrayal, heartbreak, and unimaginable pain, we have the power to choose love, to choose kindness. She refused to let her circumstances define her, and because of that, she changed the world around her. She is proof that our strength lies not in what happens to us, but in how we rise from it. The audience erupted into applause, and James felt a lump rise in his throat. He set the phone down, unable to watch any further. The words were a mirror, reflecting everything he had failed to be. Sophia's strength wasn't just in her actions, it was in her refusal to let him, or anyone else, dictate her worth. She had chosen a life of purpose, while he had been chasing a life of emptiness. That night, James sat by his window, looking out at the city. The lights blurred as tears filled his eyes. He had always thought he was the one with power, the one who made the choices. But now he saw the truth. He had never truly understood what power was. Power wasn't in manipulation or control, it was in resilience, in the quiet strength to rise above and create something meaningful. For the first time, James allowed himself to grieve, not for Sophia, but for the man he had been and the man he had failed to become. He knew there was no redemption waiting for him, no way to rewrite the past. All he had now was the emptiness of what he had lost, and the knowledge that it was a pain he would carry for the rest of his days. James woke the next morning to the pale gray light filtering through his curtains, his head heavy and his chest tight. The hours he had spent staring out the window had given him no answers, no relief. He moved through his apartment like a ghost, each step weighed down by the realization that his life had become a shadow of what it once was, or what it could have been. Weeks passed, and the monotony of his days became unbearable. He found himself walking aimlessly through the city, drawn to places he hadn't visited in years. One afternoon, he stood outside the cafe where he and Sophia used to meet during their early days together. He could almost see her there, sitting at their favorite table by the window, her eyes lighting up as he approached. The memory was a cruel reminder of how much he had taken for granted. Inside, the cafe bustled with life. He ordered a coffee and sat near the window, watching people come and go. As he stirred the cup absent-mindedly, he overheard a conversation at the next table. Two women were talking about the Sophia Foundation. "I can't believe how much they've done," one of them said, her voice filled with admiration. "That shelter saved my sister's life. She was at her lowest, and they gave her hope." James froze, the words cutting through the dull haze of his thoughts. He hadn't realized just how far-reaching Sophia's impact had been. Her name was spoken with reverence, her legacy a beacon of hope for people he would never meet. The depth of her compassion, her ability to transform pain into purpose, was a stark contrast to the empty pursuits that had defined his life. As he left the cafe, James's mind raced. He couldn't escape the truth of what Sophia had become, a force of good, a symbol of resilience. And he was a man who had squandered every chance to be better. He thought about the foundation, the lives it had touched, and the possibility that even a small part of her strength could have come from enduring the pain he had caused. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow. That evening, James found himself at his desk, pen in hand, staring at a blank sheet of paper. He hadn't written anything in years, but the words began to come slowly, haltingly, until they flowed with a clarity he hadn't felt in months. "Sophia," he wrote, "I don't know if these words will ever reach you, and maybe they shouldn't. I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I know I'll never have it. But I need to say this for myself. I was wrong about everything, about you, about us, about what I thought mattered. You were stronger than I ever realized, and I was too blind to see it. I see it now, though. I see it in everything you've built, in the lives you've touched. And I see it in the emptiness of what I've become." The letter continued, spilling out the guilt, regret, and shame he had carried. By the time he finished, the page was stained with his tears. He folded it carefully and placed it in an envelope, unsure of what to do with it. He didn't expect forgiveness or redemption. He knew those were beyond his reach. But writing the letter felt like the only honest thing he had done in years. He left the envelope on his desk, untouched for days. Eventually, he slipped it into his jacket pocket, telling himself that one day, he might find the courage to send it. For now, it was a small step, a quiet acknowledgement of the man he had been and the man he could never be. The letter wasn't for Sophia. It was for the echo of her that still lived in his mind, reminding him of everything he had lost and everything she had gained. And though the weight of that realization was crushing, it was also the first glimmer of truth James had allowed himself to feel. James carried the letter in his jacket pocket for weeks, its presence both a comfort and a torment. Every time he reached for his keys or phone, his fingers brushed the envelope, and a pang of guilt shot through him. He told himself he would send it eventually, but deep down, He knew the act of writing it had been more for him than for Sophia. She was gone, her life now intertwined with the lives of others she had helped, while his remained stagnant, a hollow existence defined by regret. One crisp morning, James found himself walking without direction, his feet carrying him through the familiar streets of the city. The autumn air was cool, the ground littered with fallen leaves, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the dull ache in his chest. He stopped when he realized where he was, outside the Sophia Foundation's headquarters. The building was modest but elegant, its facade adorned with a simple brass plaque bearing Sophia's name. Through the glass doors, James could see people bustling inside, volunteers organizing supplies, staff members helping visitors, and children laughing in the waiting area. It was a world that felt distant from his own, yet he couldn't tear his eyes away. Before he could second-guess himself, James stepped inside. The warm, welcoming atmosphere wrapped around him like a balm, though it did little to ease the tension in his chest. A young receptionist greeted him with a polite smile. "Welcome to the Sophia Foundation. How can I help you?" James hesitated, his words caught in his throat. He glanced around, unsure of what he was even doing there. Finally, he said, I was close to Sophia. I just wanted to see what she built." The receptionist's smile softened, her eyes filled with understanding. "She's inspired so many of us. If you'd like, I can give you a tour." James nodded, his voice failing him. As the receptionist led him through the building, she explained the program Sophia had put in place: shelters for women escaping abuse, support groups for cancer patients, educational workshops for single parents. Each room was filled with life, with people finding hope in the midst of their struggles. James felt like an intruder in this world, his shame growing with every step. They stopped in front of a wall lined with photos and letters from people whose lives had been changed by the foundation. One photo caught his eye: Sophia, standing beside Grace, both of them beaming with pride as they opened the first shelter. Beneath the photo was a quote from Sophia: "Pain doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of something beautiful." James stared at the words, his chest tightening. The weight of everything he had lost pressed down on him, but for the first time, it wasn't just guilt he felt. It was something deeper, something quieter. He realized that Sophia's story had moved beyond him, that her legacy wasn't about the pain he had caused but about the strength she had found in spite of it. When the tour ended, the receptionist handed him a pamphlet. "If you'd like to get involved, we're always looking for volunteers. Even small contributions make a big difference." James took the pamphlet, his hands trembling. He thanked her and left the building, stepping back into the cool autumn air. He walked aimlessly for hours, the pamphlet crumpled in his hand, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what he could offer, or if he even deserved to be part of what Sophia had built. But the idea of doing nothing felt unbearable. That evening, James sat at his desk, the pamphlet spread out before him. He read through it carefully, his eyes lingering on the words, "Every act of kindness creates ripples that can change lives." For the first time in years, he felt a faint flicker of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was enough to make him pick up the phone and dial the number on the pamphlet. The voice on the other end was warm and welcoming. "Thank you for calling the Sophia Foundation. How can we help you?" James hesitated, his throat tight. Then, with a deep breath, he said, "I'd like to volunteer." The words felt foreign, awkward, but as they left his mouth, a strange sense of relief washed over him. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was a step, a small, uncertain step toward something better. James's first day as a volunteer at the Sophia Foundation was a whirlwind of emotions. As he walked into the familiar building, his stomach churned with nerves. He didn't belong here, at least, that's what he told himself. But something stronger than his doubt had driven him to show up, to try. The volunteer coordinator, a kind woman named Elena, greeted him warmly. "Welcome, James. We're glad to have you here. Let me show you around and get you started." Elena led him through the bustling hallways, introducing him to other volunteers and staff. James nodded politely, keeping his words brief, feeling like an outsider in a space filled with such genuine warmth. Elena finally brought him to a room lined with shelves stacked high with donated clothing and supplies. "We could use some help organizing these," she said. "It's not glamorous, but it's important. Everything you sort will go to someone who needs it." James nodded again, grateful for the simplicity of the task. He spent hours folding clothes, sorting toiletries, and labeling boxes. It was repetitive, mindless work, but there was something grounding about it. Each folded shirt, each packed box, felt like a small offering, something tangible, even if it was just a drop in the ocean of what the foundation did. As the day wore on, James began to notice the people around him. Volunteers laughed together as they worked, sharing stories and encouragement. Staff members moved with purpose, their dedication palpable. And then there were the visitors, the women and children who came to the foundation seeking help. James saw the gratitude in their eyes, the small flickers of hope that lit their faces as they left with bags of supplies and a renewed sense of possibility. In the corner of the room, a young boy played with a toy truck, his mother speaking quietly to one of the staff members. James watched the boy, his heart tightening. The child's laughter, so pure and unguarded, was a stark reminder of the innocence Sophia had fought to protect through her work. James felt a pang of regret, thinking of the countless moments he had wasted chasing things that never truly mattered. At the end of his shift, as James was stacking the last box on a shelf, Elena approached him. "How was your first day?" she asked, her tone gentle but curious. James hesitated, unsure how to put his thoughts into words. "It was different," he said finally. "Good, I think. It's been a long time since I've done something that felt real." Elena smiled, nodding. "That's the thing about this place. It reminds you of what matters." James left the foundation that evening feeling a strange mixture of exhaustion and calm. The walk back to his apartment felt lighter somehow, the weight he had carried for so long easing, if only slightly. He didn't expect to find redemption here, and he certainly didn't expect forgiveness. But for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose, a reason to get up in the morning that wasn't rooted in his own selfish desires. Over the weeks that followed, James returned to the foundation regularly. He sorted supplies, carried boxes, and occasionally helped visitors find what they needed. Slowly, he began to feel a sense of connection to the work, to the people around him. He found himself smiling more, speaking more, even laughing at the occasional joke shared among the volunteers. But beneath it all, the shadow of Sophia's memory lingered. Every time he saw her name on the walls or heard someone speak of her, he was reminded of the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. He knew he could never undo the pain he had caused her, but he hoped, in some small way, to honor her legacy by being better. One day, as he was finishing a shift, Elena handed him a flyer. "We're hosting a fundraiser next month," she said. "It's a big event, and we could use all the help we can get. Think you'd be interested?" James looked at the flyer, the words blurring for a moment as he thought of Sophia. A fundraiser in her name, for her work. It felt both overwhelming and right. He nodded slowly. "I'll be there." As he walked home that evening, James felt a faint glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't redemption, but it was close. It was hope. The night of the fundraiser arrived, and the Sophia Foundation's headquarters had been transformed. Twinkling lights adorned the walls, casting a warm glow over the room. Tables were decorated with elegant centerpieces, each one showcasing stories of the lives the foundation had changed. The air buzzed with energy as donors, volunteers, and staff mingled, their shared purpose bringing a palpable sense of unity. James stood near the entrance, unsure of where he fit into this world. He had volunteered to help with setup, arranging tables, and directing guests, but now that the event was in full swing, he felt out of place. He adjusted the tie he hadn't worn in years, his fingers fidgeting nervously. He wasn't here as a guest, nor as someone seeking recognition. He was simply here. Elena approached him, holding a clipboard. "You doing okay?" she asked with a smile. James nodded stiffly. "Yeah, just taking it all in." She gave his arm a reassuring squeeze. "It's a big night." You're part of something important, James. Don't forget that. He nodded again, her words settling in his chest. He wasn't sure if he believed them yet, but he appreciated her kindness. As the evening unfolded, James moved through the crowd, helping where he could, refilling drinks, guiding guests to their seats, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. But every so often, he would pause and look around, watching the room come alive with stories of hope and resilience. A moment of stillness found him near the photo wall, where images of Sophia and the Foundation's milestones were displayed. His eyes lingered on one picture in particular, Sophia standing in front of the first shelter, her smile radiant, her arms wrapped around Grace. Her joy was undeniable, her strength etched into every line of her face. James reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the frame, as if touching the photo might bring him closer to the woman he had lost. She would have been proud of this, a voice said softly behind him. James turned to see Grace, her gaze warm but piercing. She stood with her arms crossed, her presence commanding yet gentle. James swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. She built something incredible, he managed, his voice thick with emotion. Grace studied him for a long moment before nodding.
She did.
But it wasn't just for herself. It was for everyone who needed it. People like you too, James. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He looked away, his jaw tightening. I don't think I deserve to be part of this. Grace stepped closer, her tone firm but not unkind. Deserve it or not, you're here. And you're trying. That counts for something. James nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't beyond redemption. As the night wound down, a guest speaker took the stage. It was a young woman, no older than 25, who had once lived in one of the shelters. She spoke of how the Foundation had saved her life, giving her a chance to rebuild after years of abuse and homelessness. Her voice trembled with gratitude as she said, Sophia's legacy didn't just change my life, it gave me one. The room erupted into applause, but James couldn't bring himself to clap. His hands hung at his sides as tears welled in his eyes. He realized that Sophia's greatest act of defiance wasn't in leaving him behind, it was in creating something that could never be diminished by his betrayal. She had risen above him, above the pain, and built a legacy that would live on forever. When the event ended and the guests began to leave, James stayed behind to help clean up. As he folded tablecloths and stacked chairs, he felt lighter than he had in years. For once, his actions weren't about him. They were about something greater, something he would never fully understand but was honored to be part of. Before leaving, he found himself back at the photo wall, his eyes on Sophia's image one last time. Thank you, he whispered, his voice barely audible. For everything. As he stepped out into the cool night air, James realized that the path ahead of him was still uncertain. But for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of the journey. He wasn't seeking forgiveness or redemption anymore. He was simply trying to be better, one small step at a time. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. In the weeks following the fundraiser, James continued volunteering at the Sophia Foundation with quiet determination. He arrived early, stayed late, and took on any task that was asked of him, no matter how small. He found solace in the rhythm of the work, folding clothes, stocking shelves, and organizing donations. Each action felt like a piece of penance, a way to contribute to something greater than himself. The volunteers and staff began to notice the shift in him. He spoke more often now, sharing stories of his past, though he avoided mentioning Sophia directly. There was still a distance in his eyes, a hesitation that lingered when others spoke about her legacy, but his presence was steady, and his commitment was clear. One afternoon, Elena approached him while he was sorting through a shipment of donated books. She leaned against the table, watching him for a moment before speaking. You've been here almost every day, she said. You know, most people don't stick around this long. James glanced up, his hands pausing over a worn paperback. I guess I needed this more than I realized, he admitted, his voice low. Elena tilted her head, studying him. It's more than that, isn't it? You're not just here for the Foundation. You're here for her. James froze, his breath catching in his throat. He set the book down, his fingers trembling slightly. "I don't think I'll ever stop being here for her," he said finally. "Even if she's gone." Elena smiled faintly, her expression softening. "That's not a bad thing, James. But it can't be the only thing. You can honor her by helping others, but you also need to figure out what you're here for, what you want to leave behind." Her words lingered with him long after she walked away. That evening, as he sat in his apartment, James found himself staring at the letter he had written to Sophia. He hadn't sent it, hadn't even been sure if it was worth keeping, but now it felt like a lifeline. He unfolded the paper, reading the words he had written weeks ago. They felt different now, less like a confession and more like a promise. The next day, James brought the letter to the foundation. As he worked, he kept it tucked in his pocket, the weight of it a constant reminder. By the time his shift ended, the building was quiet, the volunteers and staff having gone home. James stood alone in the main hall, staring at the wall of photos dedicated to Sophia's memory. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter. He unfolded it carefully, smoothing the creases with his fingers. Then, with deliberate movements, he placed it on the table beneath her photo. It wasn't for anyone else to read. It was for her, a piece of his heart he had finally been able to let go of. As James stepped back, he felt an unexpected sense of peace wash over him. The letter wasn't an end, nor was it a beginning. It was simply a moment, one that allowed him to move forward without the weight of what could never be undone. Sophia's legacy wasn't his to claim, but he could honor it by continuing to give, to help, and to try. For the first time in years, James walked out of the building with his head held high. The night air was crisp and cool, the stars scattered across the sky like tiny beacons of hope. He didn't know where his path would lead, but he no longer felt lost. He had found purpose in the echoes of Sophia's strength, and he intended to carry it with him, step by step, for as long as he could. As the months passed, James found himself more deeply woven into the fabric of the Sophia Foundation. He wasn't just a volunteer anymore. He became a dependable figure, someone others turned to for guidance and support. The staff began to include him in planning sessions, trusting his insight and dedication. Though he never sought recognition, his quiet resolve earned him respect among those who worked beside him. One day, as James was helping organize a donation drive, Elena approached him with a clipboard. Her expression was serious, but there was a glimmer of something in her eyes, pride, perhaps, or confidence. "We're opening a new shelter in a few months," she said, handing him the clipboard. "We want you to help lead the project." James stared at the papers in his hands, his breath catching. The thought of taking on such a responsibility was overwhelming. "Me?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Are you sure?" Elena nodded. "You've proven yourself, James. You've been here every step of the way, and you understand what this work means. This is the next step for you and for the foundation." For a moment, James was speechless. He thought of Sophia, of her vision, and the strength she had found in the face of so much pain. She had believed in creating something lasting, something that could change lives. Now he was being asked to carry that vision forward, even in a small way. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice steady. "Whatever you need, I'll do it." The months leading up to the shelter's opening were some of the most challenging and rewarding of James's life. He worked tirelessly, coordinating donations, overseeing renovations, and recruiting volunteers. There were setbacks and moments of doubt, but each time he felt overwhelmed, he reminded himself of why he was doing this. It wasn't just for Sophia, it was for everyone who needed a second chance, a place to feel safe and valued. When the shelter finally opened, James stood outside the front door, watching as families and individuals entered for the first time. The building was bright and welcoming, filled with laughter and warmth. It was a place of hope, a testament to the Foundation's mission. As the day went on, James found himself standing in the corner of the main hall, observing the energy around him. Elena approached, handing him a cup of coffee. "You did good," she said with a smile. "Really good." James nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "It wasn't just me," he said. "It was everyone." It was her. Elena placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression softening. She would have been proud of you, James. I know I am. That night, as James walked home under the glow of the streetlights, he felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. The pain of his past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined him. He had found purpose in the work he was doing, in the lives he was helping to rebuild. For the first time, James allowed himself to imagine a future, not one dictated by regret or shame, but one built on the small, steady steps he had taken to become something better. It wasn't redemption, and it wasn't forgiveness. It was simply a life worth living, one that honored the strength and legacy of the woman who had shown him what it meant to truly rise. The following weeks after the shelter's opening brought an unexpected sense of clarity to James's life. The rhythm of his days was no longer clouded by doubt or regret, but filled with purpose. Each task, no matter how small, felt like a step forward, like placing another brick in the foundation of a better version of himself. One quiet afternoon, James found himself in the office of the new shelter, reviewing reports and organizing plans for upcoming programs. The hum of activity outside the room, a mix of laughter, conversation, and children's playful shouts, served as a comforting backdrop. As he worked, a knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. A woman entered, her face familiar. It was Grace, the nurse who had stood by Sophia's side during her darkest days. She had come to visit the shelter, to see the work that had grown from the legacy she had played a part in nurturing. James stood as she entered, his heart tightening at the sight of her. "Grace," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's good to see you." She smiled warmly, stepping into the room. "I heard about the shelter," she said, glancing around. "I wanted to see it for myself. And I wanted to see you." James gestured for her to sit, suddenly feeling nervous under her knowing gaze. "I didn't expect you to come," he admitted, his hands fidgeting with a pen on the desk. Grace leaned back in her chair, studying him. "You've done something remarkable here, James. Sophia would be proud." The mention of Sophia's name still brought a pang of sorrow, but it was gentler now, softened by time and understanding. James nodded slowly. "I don't think I'll ever stop trying to live up to what she built." Grace's eyes softened. "You're not living up to it, James. You're carrying it forward." That's what she wanted. Not for anyone to live in her shadow, but to take what she left behind and make it grow. Her words sank into him, filling a space he hadn't realized was still empty. For so long, he had been striving for redemption, to prove something to himself and to the memory of Sophia. But now, for the first time, he felt that maybe he had done more than atone. Maybe he had truly begun to honor her legacy. As their conversation continued, Grace shared stories of Sophia's final days, of her quiet determination to turn her pain into something meaningful. James listened intently, each word deepening his respect for the woman he had wronged and the life she had created after him. When Grace finally stood to leave, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've come a long way, James. Don't stop now. There's still so much more you can do." After she left, James sat alone in the quiet office, her words echoing in his mind. He thought of Sophia, of her strength and resilience, and the countless lives her vision had touched. He realized that his work wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the people around him, the ones who walked through the shelter's doors every day seeking hope and safety. That night, as James locked up the shelter and stepped into the cool night air, he felt something he hadn't in years: peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he was no longer afraid of it. He had found his place, not as a man seeking forgiveness, but as one building a future that mattered. And for the first time, he believed that future was worth fighting for. Months turned into a year, and James continued to pour himself into his work at the Sophia Foundation. The shelter he had helped open flourished, becoming a haven for those who had nowhere else to turn. Families found warmth, women discovered their strength, and children laughed and played in safety. James watched it all with a quiet pride, knowing that while the foundation bore Sophia's name, its success was carried forward by the hands of many. One afternoon, as he walked through the bustling halls of the shelter, James heard someone call his name. He turned to see Elena approaching, her face lit with an expression he had come to recognize. She had news. "We've been approved for the grant," she said, holding up a folder triumphantly. "The expansion project is officially happening." James's eyes widened. The grant had been a long shot, a proposal to build another shelter in a neighboring city. They had spent months preparing the application, poring over every detail, knowing it could transform their reach. Hearing the words now felt surreal. "That's incredible," James said, a genuine smile breaking across his face. "When do we start?" Elena handed him the folder. "We'll need someone to lead the project." "Naturally, we think that should be you." James hesitated, his mind flashing back to where he had been just a few years ago. The man who had walked into the foundation, burdened with guilt and shame, was almost unrecognizable now. Taking on this new challenge felt like both a daunting task and a chance to step further into the legacy he had come to cherish. "I'll do it," he said after a moment, his voice steady. "Let's make it happen." The following weeks were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. James found himself traveling to the new location, meeting with community leaders and coordinating with architects and contractors. The work was exhausting, but it filled him with a sense of purpose that made every long day worth it. One evening, after a particularly long meeting, James returned to the shelter and sat alone in the empty common area. He leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling, the exhaustion of the day settling into his bones. Despite his fatigue, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. This life, this purpose, wasn't something he had ever imagined for himself, but it had become everything he didn't know he needed. His thoughts drifted to Sophia, as they often did in quiet moments. He thought of her strength, her vision, and the way she had turned pain into something beautiful. He wondered what she would say if she could see him now. Would she be proud? Would she forgive him? The questions lingered, unanswered but not haunting. They had become part of him, a reminder of where he had been and how far he had come. James reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, worn photo of Sophia that he had kept with him since the day he found it at the foundation. He placed it on the table in front of him, his fingers tracing the edges gently. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the stillness of the room. "For everything." The moment was interrupted by the sound of laughter coming from the hallway. A group of volunteers entered, their arms full of donated supplies, their faces lit with the joy of giving. James smiled, tucking the photo back into his pocket. There was still so much work to be done, and he was ready for it. As he joined the group, helping to unload boxes and listening to their stories, James felt a warmth that had once been foreign to him. It wasn't redemption, it was something deeper, something quieter. It was belonging. For the first time, he wasn't chasing the ghost of who he used to be or the man he had failed to become. He was simply living, fully and intentionally, in the present. And that, he realized, was the greatest gift Sophia had ever given him.